Good evening and welcome to Illinois Law. My name is Gilda Hudson-Winfield and I will be your moderator tonight. This is a program sponsored by the Illinois State Bar Association. Tonight we will cover the topic of forming a new business. Our panel consists of 3 lawyers who are members of the Institute of Illinois Business Law. Our first guest is John Doyle. John is president of Doyle Law Group, LLC. He is a Chicago lawyer specializing in corporate and business law, and he has a BBA, an MBA, and a JD from Loyola University of Chicago. He is a former chair of the Illinois State Bar Corporation Securities and Business Law Section Council. He's also a former member of the Illinois State Bar Association's Legal Technology Committee, and he was most recently the chair of the Institute of Illinois Business Law. Our next guest is Phil Hablutzel. Phil has a MA and a JD from the University of Chicago. He is a professor at Chicago-Kent since 1971. He is an author of the 3-volume treatise on corporate law and the 2-volume treatise on corporation and banking law, international banking law. He is the chief draftsman for the revision of the Illinois Not-for-Profit Corporation Act and a former member of the ISBA Committee on Commercial Banking and Bankruptcy Law and former chair of the ISBA Committee on Corporation, Securities, and Business Law. Sherwin D. Abrams is a partner with Abrams and Chapman, LLP. He is a member of the Illinois State Bar and has a BS and a JD degree from Northwestern University. He is currently an adjunct professor at Chicago-Kent College of Law and has a business practice since 1967. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Let's talk about forming a business. There are many people nowadays who want to start a business. What are some of the legal entities that one can look into if they want to start a business? John?
Well, you've got, there's a lot of legal entities. The ones probably most germane would be a sole proprietorship, a partnership, a corporation, and a limited liability company. And a limited, there's the sole proprietorship.
Let's talk about each one of them separately.
Just briefly, and I know we're going to go into them all, but the sole proprietorship is just a person who forms their own business, hangs their sign, and maybe gets a doing business as a DBA. They file a DBA with the county, and they may be doing business as Joe's Grill. And if the person is the only person that owns that business, that would be a sole proprietorship as a matter of law. That person would be have unlimited liability for any exposure or liabilities of the business, and so it's really it does not have limited liability like some of these other entities. Partnerships, same way. Partnerships like sole proprietorship, except it has 2 or more people who are forming a business and say we're going to be in business together, and they are also liable for the debts and liabilities of the partnership. Contrast that with a limited liability entity like a corporation or a limited liability company, and those 2 entities are formed with the Secretary of State, and if you comply with the requirements of doing that, then you will have limited liability, and that means that any debts of the business owned by the corporation or debts owned by the limited liability company, which is called an LLC, those creditors of those entities can only come after the assets of those 2 entities and cannot come after the assets of the people who own them. So those 2 limited type of liability entities are pretty much a very favored approach to forming a business.
Let's talk about the legal act of forming a business. Can anyone form their own business? Can they start their own corporation?
Well,
Phil?
one of the time-honored ways of doing it is to do nothing. You don't see a lawyer, you don't file with the Secretary of State, you ask for nothing, and if you're doing business and you're making a profit, say somebody's doing woodworking in their basement and they're selling their chairs that they make to their neighbors, you have a tax problem that the IRS will be interested in what you're doing, but aside from the tax problem, you have a sole proprietorship. It means that if any defects come, if anybody gets injured by the tables and chairs that you make, you'll be sued personally. So the tax consequences are there and the liability consequences are there. That's doing nothing. If two or more people go into business together and they do nothing, they're a de facto partnership. They may not think they're a partnership, they may not want to be a partnership, but the law says they are one if they own something together and they do something for profit. Or if you hire a lawyer, and maybe you can do it yourself, you could form an entity. You could ask the Secretary of State for the permission of the state of Illinois to be a corporation or to be an LLC, a limited liability company. That takes some lawyering skill because you have to sort of make a determination as to how you really want to run your business. You have a tax problem, you have a liability problem, and you have a management problem. And the management problem has a lot of different aspects. It could be a what happens down the road 5 years if somebody wants to get out of the business. How do you form now an exit strategy for that possibility? So thinking about these different aspects means that somebody who wants to go into business ought to think ahead. How long am I going to run this business? How big is it going to get? How many employees will I have? Will it be nationwide? Will it be local? Am I going to do it 10 years? Do I want to do it 20 years? If I die, does my wife or my spouse want to do it? You have to think about all these things ahead of time, and that may take some legal advice, or at least some business planning advice.
Sure.
Well, technically, anyone in Illinois could go to the internet, to the Illinois Secretary of State's website, and fill in the blanks and create a corporation or a limited liability company. As Phil suggests, though, that would not be a wise move. While it's theoretically possible, there's so many considerations to take into account that people should have proper legal counsel before they try to create one of these entities. Corporation or limited liability company is an artificial entity unto itself. It's authorized by the statutes of every state. And if you comply with the technical requirements of the statute, the state will recognize your entity as something separate and apart from its owners. A corporation is owned by its shareholders or stockholders. Those terms are synonymous. A limited liability company's owners are called its members. Why the owners of an LLC are called members and the owners of a corporation are called shareholders, they just are. But they're essentially equivalent. But the point is that the entity, be it a corporation or an LLC, is considered a person under the law that exists separate and apart from its owners.
John, why would someone want to set up a corporation? You've alluded to some of the issues, the tax, the liability. Could you speak a little bit more to that?
I think you clearly want to form a corporation or a limited liability company, number one, for liability purposes, for protecting your personal assets. I think you want to do that if you just think about an auto body shop that does work on brakes, for example, and if the brakes don't work and somebody has an accident and there's injuries, what's going to happen is that auto body shop or service center is going to be sued. And if you are a partnership or a sole proprietorship, your personal assets and wealth, whatever you have, is subject to really the claims of the plaintiff and the creditors and the people who are injured. So from a tax standpoint, clearly you want to be, from a liability standpoint, clearly you want to be a corporation or a limited liability company. I think from as Phil and Sherwin pointed out, there is, it's not necessarily easy. even though you should have a lawyer do it for the reasons that Phil said and Sherwin, because there is a lot of planning that has to go into it, many people don't. As Sherwin said, they just go online and with the Secretary of State and go to cyberdriveillinois.com and form it, and you can get it done in a matter of 30 minutes. And so people do that because they don't realize that that they need to do a little bit more planning. Clearly, if you're going to have a one-person corporation, there's perhaps less planning, but if you're going to have 2 people or more in the corporation, then if you need to have more planning, because it's what happens if you disagree. You're 50-50 shareholders, and so you could handle all those things in advance when everybody's sitting down and being reasonable, or you can do it later and spend a lot of money on lawyers. And so from you know, I think so the liability, I think there's you know, there's good reasons to do it from liability standpoint and from a management standpoint.
Okay.
You know,
Well, why don't we hold that thought? We're going to take a break and we'll be right back.
Bye-bye, Tyler.
Dear, it's time for serious talk.
Oh?
About my daycare. When I started out, it was just to help the neighbors. But lately, it's getting to be a real handful. I need some help.
What can I do?
I need advice on more space, a loan,
What about incorporating?
and insurance.
Wait, I know who we can call.
Times like this require sound advice. Your lawyer can help. A message from the Illinois State Bar Association. Over and over. Time and again.
Drive me nuts. Shut up. You're the dumbest.
Generation after generation.
I hate you too.
Isn't it time we stop the cycle? Now.
I hate you.
Stop adult violence. Teach kids peace. A message from the Illinois State Bar Association.
Welcome back to Illinois Law. Our panel has been discussing the formation of a business entity, whether it be a corporation, a limited liability, a sole proprietor. Let's talk, pardon me, let's talk a little bit about the advantages of each of the entities. Let's start with the corporation. Phil, if you can
The
address
advantage
that.
of a corporation, one advantage is we've had them around for a long time and everybody knows what they are. Most states have had a general corporation statute since the 1870s. That's been a long time. And the corporation statute in every state gives you the answer to a whole lot of minor questions about when you have annual shareholders meetings and what is a notice requirement and who gets to vote and all these things which would have to be drafted from scratch. It's all in the corporation statute. So if you form a corporation fast, the judges know what it is, your creditors know what it is, your banker knows what it is. All you have to do is give them a copy of your articles of incorporation. Everybody knows that there's limited liability, that the owners are not subject to the torts and the contract liabilities of the corporation. So it's easy, it's fast, it's cheap, and it's well known. The disadvantage is, of course, the taxes, because a corporation is a legal person, and since 1917, the income tax taxes persons. That's not just human beings like you and I, but also corporations are taxpayers. And so when a corporation makes a profit, it has to pay a corporate income tax, and then when it distributes the remainder after-tax income to its shareholders by way of dividends, they have to pay a second time. So that's the famous double taxation, which is the biggest disadvantage of corporations. That's not to say that your tax planner can't get around that somehow, and many small corporations do get around that through various devices, but that is a consideration for corporations.
Like an S corporation.
Like an S, yeah, there are other ways of getting around that. We should have mentioned at the beginning, we're talking about the 4 major kinds of entities. There are another 5 or 6 which are sort of minor that we won't go into, limited liability partnerships and subchapter S corporations and co-ops and religious corporations and all other kinds. But we're talking about the 4 main things that would really be considered by somebody starting a new business like a restaurant or a cab company or any other business.
And all of these entities are separate, are handled separately in terms of their taxation, in terms of liability. And when you talk about liability, you talk about personal, someone getting injured on the job or that type of thing.
You have tort liability, that's primarily injuries, and it's contract liability. For example, if you have a small cab company with 5 cabs and you ask yourself, do they generate many injuries? The answer is yes, they do generate injuries, but they're almost always traffic accidents. If you can get insurance for that, then maybe the liability question is not so important. If you're running a restaurant, your biggest liability is lack of customers, and you can't really get an insurance policy for lack of customers. Your other liabilities may be injuries, toe main cases, slip and fall cases, so a restaurant has to consider the liabilities. It's one thing to get your business wiped out. It's something else to get your business and you personally wiped out, and they take your house and your car and all your assets.
What are some of the advantages, John, if I could, for some of the other entities?
Well,
the partnership, perhaps? Or?
Why don't we start with the limited liability company, because
Sure.
that's the other limited type of entity, liability entity. And as Phil said, the corporation has been around for a long time, and so everybody knows what it is. And pretty much the corporation law, as Phil said, spells it all out. You know, how do you call shareholder meetings? Who are shareholders? How do you elect directors? A whole myriad of number of types of formalities within the corporation, how to run it, how to operate it. A limited liability company is more like a partnership from this standpoint. The law is not as developed. It's a relatively new entity. It's been around since the 1990s. And it's more of, instead of having this vast law that specifies all these different rules, pretty much the rules are specified by the agreement between the members or owners of the LLC. And so there is a operating agreement, which is agreement among the people who own it, and it spells out all, you know, whatever you want. So it can be a very custom type of document to really be tailored to the type of business that you're going to have with your members or partners. And so a lot of people like that because there's a lot more flexibility. For example, you can have people, you know, if you own 10% of a business, of an LLC, you know, you can get 10% of the income, but you can have a 5% vote for this, or you can slice and dice all kinds of rights that you couldn't do in a corporation or couldn't do easily in a corporation. And so there's a lot of attractiveness to people to have LLCs because the document can create the rules for you in large part. So
when you're starting an entity, you're often very concerned about the costs. And one of the differences between a corporation and a limited liability company in Illinois is the filing fees that the Secretary of State collects in order to create one of these entities. And generally, you can create a corporation for, what is it, $125 now.
Yeah.
But to create a limited liability company requires a filing fee of $500, or if you do it online, I think it's $600. And then there are annual fees, and more often than not, the annual filing fee for an LLC is somewhat higher than for a corporation. A corporation can get away with a minimum annual filing fee of $100. For an LLC, it's $250. On the other hand, a corporation requires a great deal more formalities. You have to have annual shareholder meetings, or at least have the shareholders sign a consent whereby they elect the directors of the corporation. And then the directors have to have annual meetings where they elect the officers. And if these corporate formalities are not adhered to, the liability shield can be lost. An LLC, a limited liability company, on the other hand, does not have to observe any of these formalities and is more likely than a corporation to preserve the limited liability. I'd like to make one point when we talk about tort liability. A corporation or a limited liability company will not protect someone from liability for his or her own personal negligence. If you're driving, even if the car is owned by the corporation and you run a red light and run someone down, you're going to be personally liable. If an employee of the company runs somebody down, the corporation is going to be liable, but you as the owner will not be. That's what we mean by limited liability.
Okay.
Well, John talked about flexibility, and for an LLC, flexibility is a two-sided sword. Flexibility means that you can draft your operating agreement tailor-made to these three people starting a business. And it's very flexible. On the other hand, somebody has to draft that, and that's complicated, and that means a lawyer's fee, and unfortunately they cost some money, so that setting up an LLC may cost you more, not just the filing fee of $500, but somebody has to draft a very complicated document. It's a good document because it's tailored to you, whereas in a corporation you don't need a really tailored document so much as you do in an LLC or in a partnership.
We haven't yet talked about how a limited liability company is taxed. We know that a corporation is taxed as a separate entity. Limited liability company can make a choice, and most people choose to have the LLC not be taxed as an entity, so that any profit earned by the LLC flows through directly to its members, and the members are taxed on what would have been the entity's profit.
So you can avoid the double taxation, perhaps?
Absolutely.
That's one of the biggest advantages.
The disadvantage to having that flow-through taxation is if the LLC doesn't have enough cash to make a distribution, you may wind up paying tax on money that you haven't yet received.
That could be a problem.
Advantages and disadvantages, and you have to, there's so many considerations in connection with determining the choice of business entity.
We said earlier that corporations have been around since 1870. LLCs have been around since about 1992, so we're still at the beginning, and we're seeing that many more LLCs are formed every year. Today, John got the statistics from the Secretary of State's office. In 2010, there were 38,500 new corporations, and there were 27,500 new LLCs. So year by year, at least over the last 4 years, we have a vastly increasing number of LLCs formed. For a small business that's not going to go national and is not going to sell its stock to somebody later, is not going to be traded on an exchange, LLC is probably the more reasonable way to go.
Okay, John?
More flexible, a little more expensive, but more flexible.
Okay. And I think Sherwin mentioned that there's a possibility that the corporation may lose its status. What are the implications of that?
Well, then the owners of the corporation have personal liability. If they've, it's called piercing the corporate veil.
Okay. Could you give me an example of how that might happen, perhaps?
If a corporation has failed to hold its annual meetings, doesn't keep proper minutes of what would be considered corporate action, the court can say your owners are in effect a partnership, and as general partners they would have personal liability for what they thought were just the obligations of the business. So
a good one. No, I'm sorry.
Give me an example.
A good one is that another example is commingling your funds. So you have, what you do is you have corporate revenues coming in and you put it into your personal account. And so you aren't treating, if you don't treat the corporation or the limited liability company as a separate entity, a corporation for example, and you take money and put it into your personal account where it should be a corporate account, What's going to happen is they're going to find that out in litigation. They're going to say, you're not treating this as a separate entity because you're putting the money right into your personal account, so you're not treating it like a corporation, so we're not going to either.
You can have that problem with the LLC.
Absolutely.
But the advantage of the LLC is that it doesn't have to observe the other corporate formalities of having annual meetings.
Yeah.
And
It's
so
as if the court is saying, if you ignore the corporate form, so will we.
And so
Yes.
all the shielding that you may have had as a corporation would be lost.
Would be lost,
And
right.
therefore all the liabilities, the tax
Are yours personally,
structure
right.
would change.
And so you have to keep separate, as they said, separate books and records. And then in operation, you have to make sure the money all goes into the corporate account, and then you can take it out, but
And keep separate corporate records, separate books of account for the entity itself.
The standard case is a general contractor who wants to keep his workers busy, so in their off period, he has them remodel his own kitchen. And that's commingling the assets of his business with his private.
Okay. And somebody falls or gets hurt.
That's right.
Then you have a
At that
problem.
point,
Yeah.
then they've got a problem in terms of
And they also have an Internal
being
Revenue
able to
Service problem.
shield.
Or the typical case of the mom and pop grocery store, where they simply, to feed their own family, they take the food off the shelf. They're commingling.
All right. So it would behoove someone to speak with a lawyer and talk with them about their business as to what corporate entity would be the best for their particular business. Would you agree
And particularly,
with
and
that?
particularly for planning down the road. People who start a business have a very simple idea. We're going to go into business and make money. But it's more complicated because they have to think about what happens when somebody dies, what happens when 5 years from now somebody wants to retire and go to Florida, when something will happen down the road, and let's plan for it now, and that takes some planning.
Absolutely.
And that takes a lawyer.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you again for your time and for all your good information. I want to thank our audience for their attention, and I wish you a good night.